So now we have a plastic mat that looks like it's been used on our handle and kind of our little knob right here, our nozzle. And then we can see that our kettle looks like it is metal that has seen some age, and it's taken into account some of that curvature to kind of apply there. But I feel like we need to kind of add some story to this. So whenever you're adding or working on an object, you really need to think about how that object's been used. And we'll go through different methods to kind of add wear and tear and other characteristics to tell a story through your object later. But let's look at this kettle. And that may sound corny to kind of add a story to your object, but it really helps in terms of selling the realism. And that realism also matters when you're doing stylistic textures, because kind of some of those story and uses are still going to kind of play into the character of your object. So what we need to do is just think about how the object's used. So how would you use a kettle? It's like you're going to put hot water in it, you're going to put it on the stove, you're going to grab the handle and you're going to pour it out. So we'd likely see some wear and tear around here on the handle. We're not doing painting right now, so we'll leave it as is. I also don't think it's that important because we won't be that close to it. But we do know that from being on the oven repeatedly and the apparent age of the object, that the bottom would probably be a little bit burnt. And this will also be a great time to kind of show how to use various channels over here. So let's go up here, add a base color, and we're going to go ahead and we're going to click this little paint butt here to add a fill layer. And you can see that it'll automatically drag it into the folder that you have selected. So I'm going to go ahead, drag that out of the folder. Again, that operates very similarly to how Photoshop offers. So let's go ahead and we're going to call this burn. And let's just choose an obnoxious base color here so that we can easily see what we're doing. So we'll go ahead, grab green. That way there's no mistaking where it is affecting. And we're going to come down here to smart materials. Now, smart masks. And what we're going to do is we can play with these different masks, but we can they have like a lot of options. And for the most part, it's going to cover most cases. Now, what we want to do is kind of get that fill to go from the bottom to the top. And they do have some in here. So you can see that they have some for like wet spots and streaks that would kind of give that illusion. And what we're going to do is use ground dirt. So ground dirt would be great if you were doing like a car or a tractor or a bike and you wanted to kind of get that dirt splat on the bottom, but we're going to use it kind of for our burn. So let's go ahead, we'll grab the smart material and we can drag it onto our layer here. And we can see that now from the bottom up, we are revealing our burn. So let's go ahead, alt click this. Now it's not likely that the burn would be all over the handle up here. And if we come here, so if we have this clicked, it'll keep everything hidden. But if we click here, we can see all the various masks, generators and filters and other effects that are applied onto this layer. And we can see here that there is a bitmap that has been applied. And what this is just a grunge map being kind of applied over the entire thing. So if we turn that off, we can see that grunge map is where a lot of that's coming. So we'll go ahead, we'll click this little X here, which will delete that grunge map. And we don't need that for this effect. And we can see here that we have a mask editor on here. So a mask editor is just kind of a general mask generator that's been applied on there. There's not many things in it. It's very kind of like generic. It's a very good starting point, and it's kind of like powerful. You can input a lot of things into it and kind of move from there. And a lot of these smart masks come from a basic mask editor, and then they've just had their parameters tweaked. So let's go ahead and look at some of the parameters we have down here. So we have our global blur, which is exactly what you would think it would do. It will blur everything. And our global balance here, which is going to kind of go, from extreme to covering the whole thing to not at all. We have global contrast, which will add contrast to the effects we have there. And then here we have textures. So you can import textures or use kind of the default ones they have. So you have texture 1 and texture 2. And then when we come down here, we have the inputs for those textures. So here they took a grunge, rust, and fine. So if we come over here to our textures and we clear out that, we can see that we have various textures here that we can pull from. And then here, which is where they're most likely pulling from for most of their smart materials, you have all these kind of grunge masks. So you can go ahead and change those. I think that kind of a rusty grunge works for kind of this burning look. So we're going to go ahead and leave that, but this is where you would change that if you want. Then we can come up here and we can kind of play with these parameters. So we kind of have texture 1, and you can see how that is applying that texture to the mask. And then you have texture 2, which will also kind of apply that a bit further. And then we can have ambient inclusion play more of a role, and we can have curvature play more of a role. And if we have curvature, you can see it's going to take into account the curvature of the object there. That is very useful when you're trying to add edge wear and paint wear. We'll be using that later on the cabinets. And if I twirl down that curvature, you can see that you have all these options, and we'll go through a bit of those later, but you can see you have sharp, fine, soft, medium, large, big, huge, and you can really dial in that curvature. That's an extremely powerful feature. Most of the time when you're using a smart mask, you're going to start with a mask editor. Then usually you're going to input a texture and kind of tweak your texture settings a tiny bit. And you'll mostly spend most of your time kind of in the global settings and the curvature settings. Now there's a lot of things in there to fine tune. In this case, we have the position gradient. So if we twirl down the position gradient, we can see that right to left is turned down to 0 and top to bottom is turned all the way up, front to back's turned off. And you can use these kind of create positions. So for example, we want top to bottom auto here, and we can invert that, so we can make that kind of inverted as we want. And we can use that position gradient to determine how high we want that to appear on the object. And this can be very useful. So for example, if you were doing an object you wanted to look like it had sat out in the rain for a while, you could flip that and have it coming from the top to the bottom. And there's a lot of uses for it. But let's go ahead and we can tweak that position gradient. Now, usually when you have a burn on a kettle or something, it's really only around this height. So we can go ahead, we can kind of bring that down. And that's looking a lot more realistic to me and a lot more believable. Usually you don't get a burn much higher than that. So let's go up here. And this is where you have a lot of power with these fill layers. So we can come here and we can play with all these options. So down in the properties, when you click the layer, and you want to make sure you have the right one selected. So over here, you'll see that it's going to show you properties for paint to paint into your mask, but we want to pay attention to make sure we have this one clicked so that we can see all the different channels. So first of all, we can turn channels on and off for our layer. So if we didn't want color, we could turn off color. And if we didn't want metal, we could turn off metal, and so on. And in the case of this, we're not going to be using height, and we're not going to be using normal, because we're really just trying to affect the materials beneath it. So we'll go ahead and we'll do that. We're not trying to change the normal and the height with this burn. We want it to inherit the normal and height from our steel scratch surface. We're just changing the roughness and the metal and the color. So let's go ahead and let's turn off our color for now so that we can kind of focus in on the metal. So whenever you have channels turned on, you will see that it gives you parameters down here to do. Now, we'll show you later, you can actually add more channels, but what we can do is we can actually drag in different materials into these channels, which we'll be doing later. But when we're working with like roughness and metallic, it's great because it gives us these little sliders. So I'm going to go ahead, turn off normal and height. I'm going to turn off color again so that you can see easier. And you can see that right now metallic is set to 0. So we're saying everything that is burnt has no metallic nature, but we can also turn this up and get rid of that. Now, I think that we could maybe do 0.9, that it's lost a little bit of its metallic nature, but not all of it. So let's go ahead, type 0.9 there. And then for roughness, so if we turn this all the way up, it's going to completely remove any sheen. If we turn this all the way down, it's going to be very glossy. Now, I do think it should be kind of rougher than our metal. And if I go ahead, turn that up to around kind of 0.57 there and move my light around, we can see that it's kind of introducing some roughness there. Now, burn will affect the color. So let's go ahead and turn that color back on. And what we can do is we can go ahead and we can take this parameter here, we'll move this back over to a grayscale, and then we're just going to drop it just ever so slightly. And if we move it all the way to black, I think it's a bit much. So I'm going to move it kind of to a darker gray. And I feel like that gives us a pretty kind of realistic burn around the bottom of the kettle. Now, I do feel like now in practice, I could have maybe a little bit more visible there. It seems like it's not showing up much. So let's go ahead, grab this mask editor, and we can play with our parameters here until you get something that works best for what you're looking for. So as the texture's turned up higher, it's going to kind of like crank that mask more. So I'm actually going to turn the texture down just a little bit. And with that, you can kind of see I'm getting a lot more fill there. So I'm going to come down to the position gradient and pull that down a little bit, but because that gradient's like so wide, you can see that now this is fading again. So I'm going to come back up here and I'm going to turn my contrast up a little bit to introduce a little bit of contrast there. Now, another way we can do that is we can come up here let's right click here. And then you have these options down here, and we'll be covering a majority of these through the course, but let's go ahead and add a levels. What that's going to do is, like an adjustment layer in Photoshop, it's going to adjust everything underneath it. So you can go ahead and we can pull this up, and I really just want to pull that one right there to kind of introduce a bit more color there. Now I'm going to kind of click out so that we get back, and we can see that now we have a lot more kind of a natural burn moving around. And with that, we're ready to export this texture.